Well, good morning. If we could all take our seats here, we'll get started with Manny's presentation. You know, I have this bio for Manny, and I thought, well, nobody needs an introduction. You know, everybody knows Manny, right? And I got to thinking about how many first-timers are actually here at this conference. Had an amazing luncheon on Friday, and the place was packed, and it was so good to see new members and first-timers here. So if you're a first-timer at PMOPA, raise your hand. That is amazing. Welcome. Well, welcome to what I feel is really the highlight of this event. And it's a hard one sometimes to have to listen, but we all learn. And as I mentioned earlier, I fly differently because of this presentation that's going to come up. You think differently when you have weather coming up. You prepare yourself differently because of what you're about ready to see. And a little bit of background about Manny. He's a retired general surgeon. He studied biological engineering in Boston and medical school. Later he got an MBA and became his hospital's systems chief medical officer, where he focused on data-driven quality and safety improvement. He's been flying solo since his 16th birthday in Puerto Rico, where he put off getting his driver's license so he could get his airplane license, his pilot's license. He bought an '89 Mirage in 1997, did a jet prop conversion in 2004. He's a former president of MMOPA and the current chair of the Safety and Education Foundation Board. Manny's been reviewing our PA-46 accident report at our annual convention since 2006, and he has put somewhere between 200 to 300 hours of his own time in putting this information together for you all. So with that, Manny Casiano.
Thanks, Chuck. Well, good morning, everyone. Before I start on this, just a reminder, if you have one of those WINGS forms, be sure to get them back to the desk for Dave McVinney so you get WINGS credit. Hope you all have enjoyed so far our 2024 convention. And thanks very much for sticking around this morning. I appreciate it. My goal, as it is every year, is to discuss the accidents and other mishaps we've had since our last meeting in Colorado, and try to put them into the larger context of all the safety information you've seen. And you're going to see, even the talk we just heard, the relevance of that takeoff brief in some of what we're going to see shortly. In many of these cases, especially the more recent ones, we really don't know exactly what happened in a particular accident, but I'm a really strong believer in trying to learn from other people's misfortunes and try to avoid those ourselves. Life is sort of too short to make every mistake yourself. Just a brief intro for those of you who haven't memorized these reviews yet. The FAA has a very specific definition of what is an accident, and it's basically very similar to what we saw with Admiral Bush yesterday. It's significant injury or significant airframe damage, and serious injury is pretty self-explanatory. I'm not going to go through all these details. Substantial damage has a very specific meaning to the FAA vis-a-vis accidents. Basically, they're trying to exclude the damage you'd see from a simple gear-up landing. They don't want to be bothered with those, really. So this gear-up landing, for example, would never have made it. It never did make it into the accident database. Costly, but since there was no significant injury and the damage is that excluded specifically by the FAA, this is not classed as an accident. This botched go-around did not make it into the accident database for exactly the same reasons. Now, those would be in the FAA's incident database, and we'll talk about incidents a little later. But I just wanted to give you an idea of what is excluded when you're looking at the FAA's database. So with that understanding, let's start looking at some specifics. But let me first make the same disclaimer I've been making for years. I was not present for any of the events that I'm going to talk about today. All I'm doing is using NTSB information and other publicly available information to describe what I think may have happened in many cases, especially because for the more recent accidents, all I have is really very preliminary information. And as I say every year, my point is not to affix blame to anybody. The NTSB is perfectly capable of doing that on its own, as are the courts. My goal is to look at these mishaps as learning experiences. How can we make ourselves better, safer pilots by learning from other people's experiences? I will speculate, especially on causes, if I think it helps to make a learning point. And my final disclaimer, I really, truly do not mean to cast aspersions on any individual pilot, even when I list pilot error as the cause. The very best pilots, and we've seen this over the years, stellar, great pilots can have bad days. Any of us could. Here I'm showing you just, if you go online to the NTSB or the FAA, this is the accident and incident databases. Other countries keep their own lists, and in most cases do their own investigations, some of them outstanding. Canada, for example, does wonderful accident investigations. Other places, not so much. And one thing you should realize is that individual events can move back and forth between these lists when the FAA gets in and does a little more investigation into, for example, degree of damage, and we'll see that in a couple of cases. First, I'll talk about accidents, then I'll talk about incidents a bit, since I think we can learn from those as well. But before talking about recent accidents, I would like to do a little follow-up on some of the older ones I've presented in prior years. 3 of these where the final reports might give us some insights we didn't have when I first presented them. So the first of these happened in North Carolina about 3 years ago, a little over 3 years ago. And many of you may remember this. The NTSB published their final report just after last year's convention, so I didn't have that information at the time. It's a 2005 Meridian, and the ATP-rated pilot and his passenger were taking off from runway 23 in Manteo, North Carolina. After gear retraction, there was a loss of engine power. This was temporarily fixed by advancing the MOR lever, and the pilot turned back to the airport. The engine again lost power, and the plane landed sort of crossing over the runways, skidded into the grass where the nose gear collapsed, and thus it becomes an accident. There were no injuries. Both folks walked away, so kudos to an excellent piloting job. And in fact, this pilot was awarded the Broken Wings Award at convention, I think it was 2 years ago, for excellent handling of a power loss right after takeoff. Well, now that we've got the NTSB final report, I found it fascinating. This, for those of you who are not familiar, is the P3 line in his turbine engine. And a brief aside for those of us, myself included, who are not experts on the workings of a turbine engine, the P3 line goes from your low pressure compressor case up to the fuel controller, and the pressure in the compressor gives the fuel controller an idea of how much air is flowing through the engine, and therefore how much fuel needs to be metered into the engine as well to create the proper ratio. If you get a leak in your P3 line, the fuel controller sees less pressure and it meters the fuel down. And it can do that all the way to idle. In this picture, the arrow points to where the line connects up with the compressor case, and the circle is the connection that goes up to the fuel control unit. Okay? What happened in our accident plane is there was a leak at this junction. It was loose. The NTSB assumes that this was because it was under-torqued at some point. They couldn't really determine from the maintenance records where and how this occurred, but it was clearly leaking when they checked it. So this is an interesting example because it's a perfectly functioning engine, if you ask Pratt & Whitney. It's a perfectly functioning fuel control unit that was doing exactly what it was supposed to do, but it's an engine failure for those of us flying. Now, the interesting question so it's nice to know why this happened. The interesting question for me, though, is this situation is exactly what the MOR lever was created for. And as I said, the pilot said he initially got a response. There's no documentation that I could find whether he went back and tried to advance the MOR more. And the NTSB doesn't comment at all on this, which to me it would be a very interesting finding. Was the MOR just inadequately used? Was it misrigged in some way? Because the MOR should have fixed this problem. I mean, this airplane should have been able to continue flying. I wish I could tell you exactly what happened, but I can't. And the second accident I want to talk about is almost 3 years old. And this is a case where the NTSB actually doesn't help us much at all. I sort of predicted that, I'll show you. But this, I think, is a 2012 Meridian Olathe coming out of maintenance. Many of you may remember this accident. This, I think, is an excellent example of the talk we just heard in terms of mental briefing, because what happened after completion of the annual, the owner pilot was departing on runway 36 to head back home. He reached a ground speed of 80 knots, rotated, lifted off, climbed a little, but shortly after liftoff, he radioed the tower with an urgent need to return to the airport. He had reached about 125 feet, AGL, with a steadily decreasing airspeed. So get back to that idea of push when you lose the engine. This is clearly an impossible turn. There's no way you're going to get back to the airport from 125 feet. As he started to turn back, the airspeed decreased to just under 60 knots, and essentially he stalled and spun in about 400 feet past the end of the runway. Total time, liftoff to crash, 21 seconds. It's not much time. Okay? Couple of things that I would comment on about here. The front of the plane burned completely. Obviously, the pilot was killed. This is what was left, and I speculated when I first presented this a couple of years ago that the NTSB wasn't going to be able to find a cause, not with that degree of damage, and in fact, that's the case. So this is one of those final reports, undetermined causes. So why am I presenting this if there's no new information? And really, the reason I'm presenting this is I just wanted to make the point again, or 2 points really. The first is that mental preparation, that mental brief, takeoff brief. What are you going to do if you lose the engine? Calling the tower and turning back to the airport at 125, neither of those was the right answer when you only have 20 seconds. Okay? So that's, to me, lesson one. Lesson two, this should have been a land straight ahead or close to straight ahead. There was space there. Would you have hit the airport fence? Probably. Would you have slid across into a highway past the end? Quite possibly. But none of that would have been as bad as this. So I'm going to harp on this again and again. An off-runway landing under control beats a stall spin any day of the week. And finally, the NTSB released their report on this accident that happened last year, just before our last convention. And again, I think it's worth talking about. 2002 Mirage. There's a whole history here, so let me try to briefly summarize it. About 3 months, hold on a second. Yeah, there we go. Sorry. About 3 months before the accident flight, the plane had undergone an annual, was doing fine. You can see the report of the annual up near the blue circle. A month later, he had an oil and filter change. Again, it's shown here. And what you see in the little green rectangle down there is documentation that a new safety wire had been put on the oil sump plug. Okay? All as it should be. So 2 months later, 11 days before this accident, the pilot was in cruise. He observed a decreasing manifold pressure, partial loss of engine power, did the smart thing. He diverted and landed at College Station. Good job. A mechanic there told him he had a turbo problem, and the turbocharger needed replacement. Okay. So that was indeed replaced. And at the time, the mechanic also did an oil and filter change. And here's the documentation of that. And you'll note there's nothing about safety wire. So now you all probably know where this is headed. 11 days later, the pilot took off from College Station, headed northeast. The weather, 2000, broken, good visibility, so perfectly reasonable. While climbing through 4,000 feet, he noticed the oil temperature began rising. He reduced his rate of climb with the hopes that more airflow would take care of that problem, and wisely requested a return to the airport. He turned back, and while on vectors to the GPS approach, he noted smoke in the cabin and a complete loss of engine power. So he couldn't reach the airport at that point. did a forced landing to a field nearby. And as you can see here, the plane was totaled. He walked away without injury. So good job there. Excellent job of an off-field emergency landing. Again, getting back to that mantra of landing under control level in an emergency will usually prevent fatalities. Well, this is the oil sump plug after the accident. It was found, as I noted, with no safety wire, spinning loose, not even hand tight, and the entire engine compartment was filled with oil. There was about 1.5 quarts left in the engine. So this, I think, is a really excellent case of a pilot who did everything right, from his initial precautionary landing to getting the appropriate maintenance done, to turning back when he started to see some abnormal engine findings, and then to doing an excellent emergency landing. But mechanical causes got his plane. But I'd much rather see that than a fatal accident. So 2 of those maintenance related, and 1 tragic accident that will pretty much always remain a mystery for us. So I'm going to move on now to the more current accidents, but before I do that, I do want to make a couple of comments about looking at flight-aware pictures and weather, because many of us, we hear about an accident, the first thing we do is go to FlightAware, look at the flight track, look at the weather picture. You can't trust the weather imagery on FlightAware because, especially when trying to understand an accident, because the weather is presented on a flight at a certain period of time, and it doesn't account for the movement during the time of the flight. So what FlightAware will tell you is that they put the weather depiction for the midpoint of the flight, which makes perfect sense, but if you've got a 3-hour flight, the weather picture you're seeing could be an hour, hour and a half off of what it actually was. And just to demonstrate that, here's a personal case in my plane where it's pretty dramatic. So this is my FlightAware track back from Kevin Mead's this past June. And if you look at this, you say, why did I make that silly little indent there in the first third of the flight? What was that all about? This right here. Well, this is the real weather at the time going through that little curve. And you can see how different it is from what FlightAware shows down below, because that was a rapidly moving area. Okay? And again, I just bring that up because don't always trust what you see on FlightAware when you're trying to figure out what's going on in a particular accident. And just as a little additional part on that same flight, where I have the arrow pointed now, if you look up at the line of convection that I was just going under there, going just south of, the FlightAware doesn't show that at all either. And just to prove that to you, this is my cockpit picture of that weather versus the FlightAware picture. So again, my point is, don't accept the FlightAware weather picture as the end-all and be-all when you're trying to understand what's gone on a particular flight. So Let's move on to accidents. This is the slide I showed last year. It wasn't a particularly good year for the PA-46. It was 16 accidents with 5 of those fatal. And my depiction of fatal here is a red box around the push pin. So this is what I presented last year. Okay. This is this year. 18 accidents total, with fully 9 of those involving fatalities, over 20 people. Another bad year, especially given that many fatals. And I'll talk a lot more about this in a bit. But let me go through some of the accidents in detail, because there's a lot of stuff we can learn from looking at some of these. The first accident actually occurred just before last convention. It was initially classed as an incident, so I really didn't present it in any depth last year. But it was later reclassified by the FAA based on their definition of significant damage. It's an 84 Malibu from Kentucky to Arkansas. The pilot was climbing through 14,000 feet in instrument conditions, and he noticed his airspeed had dropped by 15 knots. It was an IMC, as I said. He says he didn't see any ice on the wings, but decided to turn on his pitot heat anyway. Okay. Obviously, it should have been on already. Shortly after he flipped on his pitot heat, his glass panel filled with red X's. The autopilot flipped off, of course, at that point. The plane started shaking. He said it was shaking bad enough he couldn't read the instruments, his backup instruments. And the plane descended pretty much out of control for 5,000 feet. He emerged into visual conditions, recovered from his inverted dive, and shortly after that, his glass panel came back to life, and he decided to continue 2.5 more hours to his destination. So here's the plane after that event. The pilot, subsequently an FAA inspector, and then an insurance adjuster, did a walk around and found the wing skin quite wrinkled, and the insurance company totaled the plane. So the FAA reclassed this from an incident to an accident. So that's how a lot of this works. I think it should be fairly obvious. Now, this was a 4,000-hour PIC pilot. Only 112 hours in the PA-46, but that's still not a total beginner. But obviously, he hadn't reviewed the rash of accidents back in the 80s when the Malibu first came out, and we saw this kind of thing. The FAA almost temporarily grounded the fleet because of these accidents and lack of experience in the flight levels and with ice. Obviously, we know the pitot heat should have been on, certainly in visible moisture, if not the whole flight. In this particular case, the pilot still would have had to deal with what was almost certainly airframe icing, but at least he would have had a full instrument panel to do it, and not an inverted dive, hopefully. Moving on, I hate to see fuel exhaustion accidents, but they still happen. This was also a Malibu. It was an 85. I couldn't find a picture of the plane. I like to show those, but I couldn't find one. The ATP-rated pilot noted it had 35 gallons of fuel. He took off from Chandler with the plan to meet up for another plane for a brief air-to-air photo shoot. But 5 miles from the runway at 1,500 feet, his engine quit. Turned back to the airport. At some point along the way, retracted the gear to try to improve his glide performance. He couldn't make the runway, and in fact, landed gear up about 500 feet short of 04 right. No injuries, so that's good. Again, we get back to that concept, land wings level under control. Significant damage to the left aileron, so that's why this is classed as an accident. When the FAA came to look at the plane, they noted there was no usable fuel at all in either tank. But the fuel totalizer said 35 gallons. To me, this is sort of an obvious example of the value of actually looking in your tanks as opposed to trusting the electronics. So he basically took off with no fuel. This is a picture. You can see that left aileron damage that caused it to be classified as an accident. Never should have happened. And next, a failed go-around. And there's a couple of these that I'm going to talk about. It's a 2018 M350. The pilot was flying from Yakima to Orcas Island up in Washington, about a 160-mile trip. He had 2,400 hours, 660 in the PA-46, so this is an experienced pilot. Orcas runway is 2,900 feet. The wind was 330 at 5, and he was landing on 1.6, so he had a slight tailwind. He was on short final, noticed about 25 feet above the runway that he was probably too fast for the remaining length of runway. 2,900 feet, you want to land well. You certainly don't want to be going too fast. So at that point, wisely, he initiated a go-around, but says before he established a positive rate of climb, he retracted all the flaps. His stall warning sounded, and he hit the hill just past the end of the runway. Fortunately, not injured. The final NTSB report basically says the cause, and I can't really disagree, pilot's unstable approach and subsequent improper configuration of the flaps during a go-around, which resulted in a stall and impact with terrain. I would agree with all of that. I guess what I would talk about here, and what I would use this to emphasize, is go-arounds properly performed should be pretty much a non-event in most situations. Certainly in a situation like this where, the hill in front of you is 50 feet as opposed to 5,000 feet. But it's not something that many of us practice enough to make it a muscle memory kind of thing. This is not a situation where 25 feet above the runway, and again, this gets back to briefing, you should be having multiple choices, gear first, flaps, how many flaps. It should be an automatic, instant response. And so I would plead for folks to go out with an instructor, practice go-arounds. They're an important tool in our toolbox, and you're going to see they're not always carried out very well. All right. The first of the too many fatal accidents. It's a 97 Mirage with a jet prop conversion. That was done in 2003, I believe. The pilot departed from Pierre, South Dakota. One passenger was in the back, headed to Steamboat Springs, so about a 380-mile trip, 100 gallons of fuel on board. Took off to the east, then turned around to a southwesterly heading and climbed. About 7 minutes after takeoff, passing through 11,000 feet, his engine quit. The pilot described this as it rolled back. He declared an emergency, turned back to the field. In the track log, you can see where he was climbing on the southwest heading. Then the engine loses power. You can see him turning. He pushes the nose over wisely to maintain airspeed. There's no mention in any of the reports I could find, either informal or formal, whether he tried the MOR lever, so I can't give you that information. But what you do see, looking at the track log, is that most of the trip back to the airport, he was far too fast for an engine-out glide. The preliminary report says that after trying a restart, he feathered the prop, so the descent rate really had to be due to his speeds, from the 140 to the 160s. I have no idea why he would have done a 360 in an engine-out situation where you're trying to get back to the field. I don't have ATC tapes. I don't know the answer to that. It makes no sense to me. But regardless, that 360 cost him 4,000 feet. So the end result of an excessive engine-out descent and the 360 is that he didn't have enough altitude left to reach the field, which he really should have been able to fairly easily reach. Now, when he saw he wasn't going to make the field, he wisely did not try to, stretch the glide. Instead, he landed the plane in some rolling hills nearby. Pilot wasn't injured, probably unclenched a little, got out of his seat and saw that his passenger in back was barely breathing, started CPR on his passenger. Sadly, the passenger did not survive, so that's the fatality in this case. I certainly hope the final report, when we finally get it, gives us a little more information as to why he lost his engine and why that rather strange 360 on the way back in an engine out. So the plea I would make based on this, one more thing that we should all be practicing is our engine out procedures. There's really no reason to be going 160 knots in an engine out glide. Maybe if you're right over the airport and want to get down quickly out of the flight levels because you're not pressurizing anymore, maybe that's a situation, but that was not the case here. This started at 11,000 feet. One more thing to put on your list of stuff that should be practiced and practiced more than just once a year. And engine out glides is something you can practice, You don't have to do it. You certainly don't have to shut the engine down. You don't have to do it to a landing. This is something that can be practiced at altitude if you feel, current and proficient yourself, or bring an instructor.
Do you know why the passenger died? It wasn't very survivable.
It was very survivable, no injuries at all to the pilot, and that was probably the more vulnerable. I do not know the answer. I'm sure the final report will talk about it, whether it was a medical situation, whether he wasn't belted in, who knows? I don't know the answer. So moving along, this is a post-takeoff accident, a 93 Mirage with a jet prop conversion. Three days before, the plane had flown from Louisiana to Nebraska. The day of the accident, the pilot departed from runway 22. But for reasons that I cannot give you and no one knows, the plane did not climb, actually banked to the left and descended into trees in the terrain. The 79-year-old pilot died. His 65-year-old passenger was hospitalized, but did survive. So I really have no idea what happened here. Was this medical incapacitation, a mechanical issue, distraction? I do not know. So hopefully we'll learn more about this one, because this one really makes very little sense at this point. Next, an accident in the Czech Republic is a 92 Mirage. From the flight track, it certainly looks like he was doing multiple takeoffs and landings, probably proficiency or training or something like that. The last landing, unfortunately, was gear up. I don't know what the extra damage that caused this to be classified as an accident versus an incident, if you remember my initial comments. But at this point, it's on the accident list. No injuries, which is good, and that's typically the case with a gear-up landing. Don't have more information on this one. And a hard landing, this is sort of an interesting one. A 2005 Meridian. Pilot was flying from Columbus, Ohio to Ann Arbor on an IFR flight plan. Ann Arbor's weather seemed relatively benign, 1,600-foot overcast, 7 to 11 knots, pretty closely aligned with the runway. However, there were a few PIREPs near the area for light rain, trace to light ice. Bases were 2,500. A PIREP from Detroit, so about 25 miles away from the landing airport, but he was closer to Detroit at some points during his flight, for light to moderate rime between 4,000 and 8,000. The freezing level was about 2,500 feet, and the pilot, as is typical in many larger city areas, was pushed down to 5,000 feet for 20 minutes during his approach through Detroit airspace. So it's certainly possible that he picked up some ice during this. He was flying the GPS 24 approach. He began what he describes as hitting turbulence at about 700 feet AGL, flying at about 95 knots. He says that on short final, about 50 feet above the ground, he encountered severe wind shear that pushed him down into the ground. Possible. When I look at it, I also have to wonder, did he have airframe ice, and as he slowed down on short final, did he stall and go into the ground for that reason? The weather on the ground was, the temperature on the ground was 2 degrees, +2, so we'll never know. But I think both of those are possible. And certainly if you're in an area that's conducive to icing and kept there by ATC for a while, it's something you should be thinking about as you come down to land. Next, a fatal accident in a matrix, which is a rare event indeed. This is a 2010 matrix. The pilot was taking the plane on a short flight for refueling prior to a family trip the next day. He departed from runway 32 at Lake Norman in North Carolina. Now, this public airport does have 100 low lead, but it's expensive, quite expensive actually. And that presumably was why he was going someplace else to get fuel before his trip, because this is his home base. He took off in a general northwesterly direction, climbed to about 3,000 feet, headed about 30 miles at a ground speed 150 to 170, so pretty routine flight. Until about 10 minutes after takeoff, where I'm showing here, where he turned left and started flying directly back to his departure airport in a slow descent. But his airspeed throughout this descent stayed at 160 to 170 for the next 8 minutes, almost back to the field. Another pilot at his field heard him report a 2-mile final for 1-4 at his takeoff in a calm voice, no mention of any issues. The last ADS-B hit was 3/4 of a mile from the runway at 60 feet AGL. He crashed into the backyard of a house 21 minutes after takeoff. Multiple surveillance videos from homes around there and 2 witnesses on the ground did not hear any engine noise at all. The pilot died in this crash. The engine had 48 hours since a manufacturer overhaul. Whether that means anything or not, I have no idea. He had fuel in both wings, throttle, mixture, prop controls were all full forward. The emergency fuel pump was on, and when they tested it, it was working. The engine-driven fuel pump had no fuel in it, although there was fuel in some of the lines leading up to it. The magnetos both were working when they were tested. The upper spark plugs had, quote, heavy carbon deposits. The cylinders looked fine on a bore scope. The crankshaft was intact. So basically, no smoking gun as to why the engine stopped. I hope we'll find out more again from the final report. So what are the lessons here? And there are a few. The sad part of this is the pilot did have options. If he had slowed to best glide, we don't know if he would have reached the runway, but he would have had a heck of a lot better chance than at 150 or 160 knots. So we get back to proficiency with engine out procedures. Furthermore, he had 5 grass runways on his route back that were all reachable. He also had 2 hard surface runways that may have been reachable at larger airports and I think these probably would have been within gliding distance, especially if his glide had been at best glide. Almost all of these choices would have been better than crashing in a backyard of a house. So we've talked about a pre-takeoff brief. This gets back to me, that idea of constantly flying along, not getting complacent, thinking, what would I do now if my engine quit? I don't know how many of you do that. I must admit, I do that. Every 4 or 5 minutes, I'm thinking, what am I going to do if the engine quits now? And I love the green glide circle on ForeFlight and all of that, but, I think it's something we should all be thinking about, both piston and turbine. Okay, we now have 2 fatal accidents. This first one from Mexico. It's a 2008 Mirage. The pilot had flown from Brownsville, Texas that morning down into Mexico. They took off from Matamoros, where I've never been, for an hour-and-a-half flight west to Saltillo with the pilot and 3 of his passengers. We do not have information as to whether the plane was fueled at the stop in Matamoros. At his destination, the pilot flew a right pattern to runway 35, and they really seemed to be on a normal approach when suddenly the plane veered sharply to the left and crashed about 600 feet short of the runway. Strange. And I can't remember, I think I need to click. Yes. So this is a surveillance video, a little piece of it. That's not survivable. There have been apparently reports down in Spanish in Mexico that the pilot reported being out of fuel just before the crash, but I have no confirmation of that. It is reinforced by the fact that in that surveillance video, there is no engine sound at all. But again, I don't have definitive information on that. Regardless, something bad happened really in the pattern in either right base or short final. Nothing in this flight seemed to be amiss up until those last 10 seconds. The quality of accident reports in Mexico is variable. Some are excellent, some not so much. So I don't know what we're going to find out on this one long term. But obviously, all 4 people on the plane died. And as I say, I hope we'll find out more about this accident later. Next, another overseas tragedy. It's a 96 Mirage, also with a jet prop conversion down in Brazil. According to the Brazilian registration files that I could find, The plane's ownership was transferred 2 months before the accident, so possibly a very new pilot to this plane. The flight left Campinas bound for Belo Horizonte, a roughly 300-mile flight. And not very far into the flight, the plane apparently broke up in convection. And in fact, a person on the ground filmed pieces of the plane falling. This was the fuselage wreckage. The wing and tail were found quite a long way off. So this is clearly an in-flight breakup. All 6 of these people, plus the child of one of the couples shown here, died. 7 people. I can't imagine that the plane wasn't significantly overloaded with a subsequent in-flight breakup. I don't have any solid information at the time, but we're going to come back to this topic of convective activity, turbulence, loading, and speed. I don't have a radar track on this, but there's no commentary as to whether this plane tried to slow down or deviate or whatever. It doesn't look like any of that happened. All right, and then the first of 2 Meridian flat tire accidents. It's a 2008 Meridian on an instructional flight. It's pretty obvious from the flight track that this was recurrent training. On landing, the plane got a flat tire on one of the mains, causing it to veer off the runway. Unfortunately, the plane hit a runway light, which damaged the right aileron, which is why this event is listed as an accident rather than an incident. Final NTSB report came out a short time ago. The flat tire was pretty mangled up, as you can see here. The NTSB noted that the tire was very worn, as shown here, and considered this a contributing factor. The tire was only about 1.5 years old. The pilot says he had been planning to have it changed at the next annual, which was coming up. And as is typical, the inner tube was totally fragmented, as shown in this last photo there. I've been fortunate enough to only have had 1 flat tire in my jet prop over 24 years. And I can certainly testify it's difficult to keep directional control. I was lucky I didn't depart the runway, but that's luck as much as anything. I guess the only lesson I would draw from this one is err on the side of keeping your tires in good condition, but even then, there's no guarantees. So, all right. The first of 3 fatal weather-related accidents here. Obviously, that one that I described earlier was also weather-related, but these are 3 in a row in a fairly short period of time. First is a 2012 Mirage. The registration information here suggests that there had been a change of owner about 3 months before the accident. The pilot was flying alone from Madison, Wisconsin down to Arkansas. So here's the big picture. Okay? Huge front crossing, as is typical, from west to east. The planned trip was going to cross that front in what I suspect was a new-to-him plane. So right away we get into a question of aeronautical decision-making on the ground. You can see that midway on his trip he had to cross this front. But recall what I said at the beginning about not trusting FlightAware. This is a FlightAware picture. You can see he turns south. I don't know exactly what this first turn is for, whether it's a deviation from his straight line course or whether he was just following his flight plan. But in either case, from this FlightAware image, you'd say, things look pretty good. A little deviation to avoid weather and then sort of a straight shot to his destination. But when he was making this turn, there are a couple of reports I found that he had actually asked for a deviation to Columbia Airport, which is in the red circle there. So perhaps that's the reason for his turn. Now, if you look at the FlightAware weather here, you'd say, why would he want to divert to Columbia, which looks like it's nestled in some of the worst weather? So here's the actual image at the time he arrives near Columbia, cruising at 16,000. Again, I don't know what he was seeing on his panel at the time, but this turn actually seems to put him in more weather. In any case, as he gets just southwest of the airport, the plane dives with a final calculated descent rate of 16,000 feet a minute, ADS-B speeds of 300 knots, so likely an even higher airspeed. At that point, it's pretty clear the plane had already broken up. The wings and tail, 3 tail pieces, were found 3 miles from the fuselage. Joe Casey in the forums suggested that icing with elevator bridging and a subsequent autopilot disconnect might have been a possibility here. That could certainly result in a full nose down trim situation in IMC, which would get your attention very quickly. Another possibility, if you look at this and you see those lightning depictions scattered all around, I mean, this was convective weather. And it's very possible that he flew into severe turbulence at cruise speed. All the ADS-B returns were at full cruise speed, and the plane just came apart. Regardless of the cause, the plane shed its outboard wings, and the fuselage hit the ground in essentially a vertical position. So, what are the lessons here? Obviously, better decision-making on the ground before you even take off, a willingness to delay or even cancel a particular flight in certain circumstances, especially in a new-to-you airplane. The imperative to slow down if you get into significant turbulence, even below maneuvering speed. At our typical, I mean, we fly these planes for the speed, let's be serious. But at our normal cruising speeds, in severe turbulence, it's highly likely the plane is going to shed pieces. And then finally, the recognition that high altitude wet clouds should basically be considered convective unless you have other information. My own personal opinion, avoid them. I guess if you're a really expert with radar and the situation is right, perhaps, but I've got too big a yellow stripe down my back to do that. Okay, another fatal accident, the same month, also likely weather-related. 2003 Meridian. The pilot, his wife, and reportedly 2 dogs were flying from Pensacola to Arkansas. And if you look at this FlightAware picture, it really seems like fairly reasonable weather, depending on the height of those clouds in the first part of the trip. Again, this is FlightAware. This is the weather at the time of the crash. And again, it doesn't look terrible. The plane departed Pensacola at 5:20 p.m., cruised at 280, no reported issues. They began to descend at the point I'm showing here, which was about 2 hours later. You can see they were descending into some radar returns. At 240, the pilot reported continuous moderate chop, and in fact there was an air met for moderate turbulence in the area, so that's not surprising. The plane never did slow down. 9 minutes after beginning the descent, they were at 220 with a ground speed of 215 knots. Two minutes later, they were at 190 going 250 knots. And 30 seconds later, they entered a spiraling right turn. The last ADS-B hit was at 15,700, going 301 knots. And then the plane was lost at 7,800 feet on radar. Almost certainly had broken up by that point. The calculated descent rate was 17,000. Of course, the 2 folks on board died. The 2 dogs were never found. Pieces of both wings were found only about 80 feet away from the fuselage, but the tail components were never located. The landing gear was retracted. So we're sort of left with the same possibilities as in so many other weather-related breakups. Too much speed for turbulence, retrospective analysis of the weather soundings that had been done in that area showed vertical wind shear between 24,000 and 12,000 feet per minute, with a high possibility of moderate to severe turbulence in that exact same area. This is retrospective, it doesn't do this pilot a bit of good. Or possible icing as a contributing factor. The freezing level was about 13,000 feet. The pitot heat was on and was working. Or perhaps both of these factors together, which is certainly possible as well. And this was a terrible accident. This was discussed a lot on the forums. Also weather-related, 5 fatalities. An 85 Malibu. This is the family that had been in Cooperstown, New York for a Little League baseball tournament, was returning home to Georgia with a fuel stop in West Virginia. This is the first leg, the first planned leg of the flight, about 400 miles, and the dashed line is his flight plan route. Now, if you look at this flight-aware picture, there's essentially no weather shown for the first while after departure. Then it gets rather ugly, but at least for the first little way, it doesn't look bad. This is totally wrong. This is the weather at the time of his departure. Now, the weather at his departure airport wasn't bad. 6,500 broken, 5 miles visibility, not bad. The pilot took off, picked up his clearance about 5 miles southwest of the field. He was cleared as filed, climbed to 10,000, and the NATC noted moderate to heavy precipitation for the next 30 miles, which would certainly go along with this picture. Pilot did acknowledge that. Here's his flight path. You can see he was sort of deviating. This is not the picture you would see for a plane on autopilot. This is pretty clear, to me at least, a hand-flown flight. Reached a maximum altitude of about 9,800 feet with a ground speed of 122 knots. Speed was fluctuating a fair bit, as you can see there. 12 minutes after takeoff, he entered a right descending spiral in the heavier weather, which I've circled here. And if you zoom in on that a bit more, the last radar hit was at 6,500 feet going 242 knots. The tail components were found about a mile from the fuselage. One wing was found half a mile from the fuselage. On the preliminary investigation, both the attitude indicator and the turn coordinator were spinning at the time of the crash. The VSI was pegged at 4,000 down, so it was probably more than that. Both vacuum pumps were found, were functional, were working. The grandfather was the pilot. It's his son, daughter-in-law, 2 grandkids. Obviously, all died. Couple of possible causes here. Obviously, turbulence is one. Spatial disorientation in that turbulence, especially if you're hand flying with rain, heavy precipitation, and so on. The end result was this spiral, shedding pieces, and an in-flight breakup. This pilot had owned his plane for many years, had been flying for many years. I have no idea, though, how proficient he was in IMC. I don't have records for that. I'm sure the final docket will contain that when it comes out, but right now I don't know. And again, we get back to the idea of convection, speed in convection, loss of spatial orientation. Pretty ugly theme that just keeps coming out. Now, let me just talk, though, a little bit about the pre-flight judgment here. Because if I had to fault anything, I think that would be the major thing I would criticize. This line of weather was moving rapidly northwest to southeast, as typically they do. This is the radar picture 1 hour after the accident. Clearly, would have been a much better flight if he had left at 2:30 or 3 instead of 1:30 in that afternoon. Now, that still leaves his fuel stop and then getting in the afternoon on a convective day down into Georgia, which could be a challenge. But at least he wouldn't have been crossing through that misery so early in his flight. In fact, this is the weather picture for 5 p.m. that afternoon, about when they'd be done refueling. And you can see it was a straight shot down to West Virginia for the refueling part at least. Now, the rest of that trip would have been ugly. So maybe you'd have been stuck with 5 people in West Virginia for overnight. So what about saying, okay, we're in Cooperstown, pretty area, just had a baseball tournament, let's all go out to dinner and leave the next morning. This is the weather picture starting at 8 a.m. the next morning. I mean, that would have been a boring, easy flight. Now, I know they probably had plans for Monday, but I'm going to get on a bit of a soapbox here for a second. I mean, I know all of us in this room tend towards the type A, tend to be somewhat driven, tend to be go-getters. We've got places to be, things to do. But if we're going to fly our own planes safely, especially with people we love on board, we need a plan A, we need a plan B, we need a plan C for every flight. And in many cases, plan C may just be wait till tomorrow, in spite of whatever appointments you might have in the morning the next day. We need to have a low threshold for going to plan B or even plan C when appropriate. And this is, to me, a case where it would have been more than appropriate. All right, I'll get off my soapbox. Next, what is likely a mechanical issue of some sort, perhaps a fuel issue, I do not know. There are no details on this one out yet. This is a German-registered 86 Malibu, was returning from Oshkosh. This particular leg was from Goose Bay to Greenland. I'm sure most of you have heard about this flight. Pilot and his passenger, southwest of Greenland. The pilot transmitted a mayday. This was picked up by Arctic Command, which is Denmark's Navy. They patrol that area of Greenland, Faroe Islands, that region. And shortly thereafter, the plane ditched in the ocean. 30 minutes later, the Danish frigate Triton, which is in the background of this picture, that ship there, arrived on the scene with drones and a rib boat. And just for the fun of it, let me show you a little drone footage. And if you look at this, you'll see the propeller's not turning. It's pretty impressive what those drones can do. So they were well equipped for a water landing, thank God. That's the drone overflying. I personally don't want to spend much time in a raft near an iceberg, but that's a whole different issue. The rib boat got to them and rescued them and took them back to the frigate. We don't know the cause of the engine stoppage. Hopefully we'll find that out, although I have my doubts since I suspect that plane is non-recoverable. Good job of the ditching. Good job of being prepared with the appropriate survival equipment. So kudos on that. And kudos to the Danish Navy. This is another power loss in a Malibu, an 85. There we go. Pilot was flying alone from Illinois to Wisconsin. About 25 miles from his destination, lost engine power, declared an emergency, landed in a grass field, exited the plane, no injury. The plane had significant damage, both to the fuselage and the tail, so excellent job, off-field landing, no injury. The preliminary FAA report hints, in a lot of vague language, but hints at fuel leakage from a fuel test port on the engine. It was a Continental 550, but I have no solid information on that at this point. And I don't know exactly what that would have meant. Regardless, it's an engine loss with a subsequent off-field emergency landing. And again, going back to that theme, in this case, no injury from that landing. Plane, a mess. People, not so much. And finally, or almost finally, a really tragic fatal accident just last month. Well, actually, we're in November, aren't we? So this was in September. 2014 Mirage. Pilot, 3 passengers were flying from Iowa to Indiana. And for those of you who were in Ed's talk yesterday, this is the flight he was talking about. Anderson is a towered airport, elevation 919 feet. Pretty straightforward VFR weather, calm winds, broken layer at 6,000 feet through the time of this accident. And I don't expect you all to memorize this, but 13 miles from his destination, so fairly close to his destination, he was 6,000 feet AGL, going 189 knots, 13 miles. At that point, Indy Center cleared him to descend to 3,000. I don't know why ATC kept them up that high till that close. But you would certainly expect, if you're in that situation, roughly, 4 minutes from touchdown and 6,000 feet AGL, that you're going to have some altitude to lose. So anyway, he was cleared for descent. He did descend at around 165 to 170 knots at 1,300 to 1,700 feet a minute. 3 minutes later, he reported the field in sight. He was cleared for a visual approach. At that point, when he was cleared for the visual approach, he was 4 miles from the field, 2,600 feet AGL. That's not a stabilized approach. Still going 165, by the way. 1 mile from the runway, he was still 1,000 feet AGL, going 150 knots, and at that point, he wisely told the tower he wants to go around. He was given a right turn and climbed to 3,000. He began to climb. You can see, started the right turn, reached 1,200 feet AGL, but his last radar return showed a ground speed of only 84 knots. The gear was still extended, and a witness reported his seeing the plane flip over and nosedive into a cornfield, stall spin. The 4 people on board died. I think it's likely that he had the engine pulled way back and somewhere in there just forgot to advance power. Could be distraction. Certainly there was a lot going on. Whatever. This is another go-around that should not have ended this way. Couple of comments on this. Besides the sort of the obvious of remember to add power in a go-around, we have some really neat avionics. Descent planning on this flight was suboptimal, resulting in a final approach from which a landing was impossible. Our avionics have lots of things to help us. This is for, this plane had a G1000. Clearly, a G1000 will identify altitudes for an instrument approach as shown here, can give you continuous required descent rates on the VNAV page. Personally, though, I actually think the VNAV capability of our avionics is just as helpful in VFR situations or on a visual approach, especially a really long straight-in visual approach. You could enable the visual approach and head for the 3-mile fix. It will give you continuously what your descent rate has to be. It's a great tool for planning. Or you could just put in pattern altitude at your destination and aim for that and know what you're going to do there. So if you haven't tried some of this functionality in VFR, play with it sometime. Go out and play with it. I find it very helpful, especially coming out of an IFR flight plan when they're giving you, a straight in to 20, 30 miles away. But even if you don't have this kind of fancy avionics, and you see that you're fast and high, as this pilot was, just ask ATC to fly the pattern, or a 360 to lose altitude. Know what your situation looks like, anticipate what you're going to need to do, and just ask for it. And again, I'll put in the plea, we should be practicing go-arounds until it's automatic muscle memory. And I believe I'm almost out of time. I think I only have about 140 slides left, so we're good. This plane, an 86 Malibu, had a bird strike. I'm not going to spend much more time on that. Here's a summary of the accidents I've been talking about, and the 9 fatals up there. As has been the case for many years, if you look down at the non-fatal landing accidents, that's a predominant feature among all of the non-fatals. These are the incidents. I'm not going to go through them. What I will say, and here's a bright spot for today, we're not seeing the predominance of runway landing, loss of directional controls that we were seeing the past couple of years. Last convention, we had 13 of those. This year, 6 or 7, even if you include the 2 flat tires. I'd like to think that that's getting the message out about speed control, tire inflation, hold the wheel off, all that stuff. We'll see if this continues. So here's sort of my summary lessons. I've got a bunch of graphs in here that I'm going to skip in the interest of time. Thank you to Dave McVinney for fleet numbers. We have about 2,400, a little over 2,400 planes flying worldwide, and Dave keeps track of every single serial number. These are our accidents. You can see we've had higher numbers in some years. Now this is calendar year, not convention year, so they're not directly comparable. And that's the trend line. If you look at rates though, this is very similar to the graphs you saw yesterday. If you look at just fatal, that's what I don't like to see, that tail going up there at the end. Here's the trend line, and you can see that trend line on fatals going up versus the trend line, which was headed down nicely. So again, this is what I would say is my summary lessons for all of us. I'm going to skip talking about this human factor, again, because I'm out of time. I'm going to post these slides this coming week on the website with my speaker's notes, so you'll be able to go through any of this that you would like. Just remember, we're the weak link in these planes. Thank you all.